and a warm welcome to the latest edition of Conversations in Drug Development, brought to you by the team at Boyds. This podcast is for our fellow community of scientists and clinicians working in the wonderful world of cell and gene therapy and drug development. Thank you for tuning in, and we hope you enjoy the conversation.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Conversations in Drug Development. I'm your host for today's episode, Harriet Edwards, part of the regulatory team here at Boyds. And today I'm delighted to be joined by not one but two regulatory guests. Dr. Katherine Bowen, our VP of Regulatory Affairs here at Boyds, and Dr. Eric Harder, Director of Regulatory Affairs. Hello and welcome both to your first 2025 episode.
I know, how very exciting. Thank you very much for having us, Harriet.
Yeah, great to be here.
And it's great to have you both here because today is our annual Get Your Crystal Ball episode.
I know, we do know that in regulatory we do have crystal balls.
Absolutely, yeah. And they're always right as well. So we're very much looking forward to being able to use those today and talk about hot topics for 2025, any trends that we think might be coming in from 2024 that we saw, whether Professor Alan Boyd and I were right when we talked in 2024 about our predictions for that.
I was worried about today's recording that you're going to go back and mark us at the start of 2026.
Yes. Watch this space. But for now, today, we will just opinions only, informed opinions on what we have to look forward to in 2025. And I'm sure it is a lot. So unsurprisingly, with our US and EU regulatory experts here, we're going to have a focus on what hot topics might be coming in from a regulatory perspective. But before we go ahead and do that, let's first recap 2024, because it was a big year for regulatory affairs and drug development in general. And the trends that we predicted in 2024, I think, are probably ones that we're going to talk about today as well for 2025. The most notable one, of course, is AI. So it was a huge year last year for AI in every sphere of life, I think, not just regulatory affairs and not just drug development. But I think it's fair to say it's going to continue to explode in 2025. And we'll see that and talk to that in a little bit more detail later. We also spoke about advanced therapies. We can't get away from advanced therapies in regulatory affairs over recent years. And I think it's fair to say that 2024 was also a notable year. As we sort of predicted, there were many cell and gene therapy products approved in 2024, 7 in the US, although 17 were to be predicted. And there were less in the EU, Katherine, weren't there?
Apparently there was only one.
Which we found quite surprising.
Let's go back and check the EMA stats. But there are a lot still in the pipeline. I pulled up the list of medicines under development. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9-ish.
So in that case,
from the medicines under evaluation, yeah. And bear in mind that quite often there's a lag from the FDA to Europe. It takes a bit longer in Europe, and usually people file in US first. Not always, but quite often. So that might just be a catch up.
So we might see that
difference, but we'll see.
A carry. 2025 maybe. And of course, although we talked and predicted about advanced therapies being a big topic in 2024, we can't also forget about the small molecules.
They haven't gone away, they work.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there were many approved last year as well, and that might set to continue, I think, into 2025. So another topic we discussed. And then finally, not regulatory specific as such, but in the drug development industry, I think we predicted and saw that financial investment is increasing. We're on a bit more of an upturn, I think I can optimistically say, and hopefully that will continue into 2025 as the sector continues to grow and we see more investment. So let's hope that's something we can talk about for 2025 as well. So with that, we should talk about the trends for 2025. And as we started with at the beginning, artificial intelligence is the obvious one that we need to discuss. I read publication on PubMed recently that said by 2024, over 60% of global regulatory teams integrated artificial intelligence and machine learning in some way, shape or form into their workflows. And that was to streamline certain tasks. So I think our jobs are safe for now. And it was certain things like dossier preparation, data extraction, auditing, etc. And so more of maybe the data mining tasks and things like that incorporated AI. But it's definitely one to watch for 2025. And there is a place for it, isn't there, Katherine?
Yes.
Do you think?
Yeah, and I think there's still a place for the human brain as well. But yeah, I mean, for some of the easier to do pieces, it does feel like a way of perhaps streamlining.
And Eric, I think in drug discovery as a whole, we're seeing AI become more instrumental in drug discovery. There is a role that is increasingly important for AI in drug discovery, and again, helping with that sort of data mining and data analysis that would manually take a lot longer to do. It's taking away some of that potential human bias, I suppose, and helping with drug discovery. Is there any thoughts on how AI in that sphere might continue to explode in 2025 over in the US?
Yeah, I think to your point, it's really just about efficiencies at the end of the day. And are you able to introduce efficiencies into the process? When I was in graduate school, there were these high-powered computers that could sift through different types of molecules as potential drug targets. Now, think about that. Obviously, grad school was a very long time ago for me. That is exploding exponentially. So whether it is in helping solve targets for potential mechanistic information, or even in some places I've seen it in like the manufacturing side to potentially do some key inputs at maybe steps where you're trying to determine if you're hitting key thresholds during your manufacturing process. Can it be more efficient, or at least replicate what a human can do and take away some of the inefficiency there? And then just from the broader perspective, we know that FDA has recently promulgated draft guidance on AI. The Trump administration has released some executive orders about artificial intelligence, trying to sort of position the U.S. as a global leader there. I can say this from practical experience, looking out my window at the 3 feet of snow on the ground. It's sort of like you're taking your sled to the top of the mountain and now you're on the downslope. I think we've hit that inflection point with AI, and we're really just kind of barreling towards the future in that regard.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, actually, because where we talked about AI and machine-based learning as a potential new tool that we can use, and there's been quite a lot of pragmatism from the regulators to incorporate those new tools up to this point. I think now there is going to be more scrutiny on the use of those tools and those processes as we see them more frequently be incorporated into the drug development process, whether that be in drug discovery or actually in analysis of data, or even in how we do our regulatory affairs jobs, I suppose. So definitely more scrutiny ahead. And the same is true in the EU.
Yeah, I think the same is true globally. And all of the regulators are recognising that there needs to be some form of regulation and guidance around how AI is used in drug development. It's interesting, the CHMP have got on their work plan for this year, specifically developing training and sharing knowledge and actually getting some AI experts into the CHMP to support the committee. Because, of course, generally speaking, the experts sat on the regulatory committees, that this isn't their sphere of knowledge, generally speaking. So there's going to have to be an effort for them to, and at the same time as the rest of us, honestly, start to build that knowledge base so they can really be informative as they're helping guide developers, but also so they've got their own guardrails in place so they can make their own judgment calls as some of this starts to come to fruition.
And I think that's a really fair point about collaboration. It's something we've talked about a lot over recent years, but certainly with the innovation task force meeting.
Some really good conversations around AI stuff, haven't you?
Yeah, and that springs to mind, actually, in terms of how we do get those experts to put those processes and procedures in place in order then to guide developers as to what's expected. So, yeah, it's definitely going to be a continued evolution. And I do think when we come to do our 2026 view of the regulatory landscape, AI will no doubt be on that topic list, but hopefully with a little bit more robustness around the guidance that supports developers in the use of that.
An industry perspective, and maybe you guys have seen similar. I feel like if I go to an event, half of the business cards I come away with are from folks with AI technology, whether it's
you're absolutely right.
Generation of clinical study reports. Maybe that's like the most classical example of you think about, but I do feel, again, this is purely anecdotal on my part, but we are seeing from that industry perspective it being a bit more pervasive.
Really good point, Eric. And just to pick up on another point that you mentioned earlier, we said this podcast is focused on regulatory, and we can't have a regulatory affairs focused podcast without talking about legislation, can we? So we have to focus on what is new from a legislative perspective, if anything at all, or what continues to penetrate through from 2024 into 2025. There's lots of changes in the EU on the horizon. I'm thinking EU pharma legislation, Katherine, but there's plenty more to discuss. And then, of course, we need to pick up on a point that Eric made around the political landscape in the US. But for now, let's think about the legislation that's changing or evolving in the EU.
Yes. And we've got the proposed changes to the EU pharma legislation. I don't think anything's actually going to happen in terms of any of that getting implemented this year, but that's got some wide-reaching consequences from exclusivity provisions. It impacts paediatrics, orphan drug designation, and the exclusivity around those. It impacts things around environmental risk assessment, and it's pretty far-reaching.
Yeah.
So I think even those who perhaps haven't had a particularly great grasp on what that might mean are going to have to start getting their fingers into that over the course of 2025 to understand what's coming. It is, of course, also the first year of the implementation of the HTA regulation and joint clinical assessments. So initially, just for ATMPs and oncology products, with orphans coming in, I'm going to say 2028, and everything by 2030. We've done a separate podcast.
We have
on that, which I believe is already available with Decisive Consulting. So it is worth going to have a listen to that. I feel like it's one of these things we've known about for a really long time, and yet a little bit like the clinical trial regulation, actually, it still seems to have crept up on people.
Yeah,
and it's not going away. And it isn't as simple as perhaps we'd have ideally liked. So I do recommend, if anyone, particularly developers for ATMPs and oncology programs, starts to get their head around what that might mean for their product.
Yeah, and I would really highly recommend, as always, listening to one of the more detailed podcasts as a initial signpost. Then,
and we should do one on the changes to the EU pharma legislation. Actually,
there is one in the planning.
On the plan.
It is on our plan. Yeah.
Right.
So watch this space for that, because the EU pharma legislation is not going away. And as you said, Katherine, the changes are going to be far reaching. And there's not really anyone within regulatory affairs that it doesn't touch. So definitely one to discuss at length, if not in one podcast, maybe more. And then, of course, there's again another topic that seems to be on our list all of the time over recent years, but again is creeping up on us, is obviously devices and changes to legislation there as well.
Well, not just legislation, kind of attitudes to it. I guess you've had some interesting experiences recently, haven't you, Eric?
Yeah, and when we think about devices, we can sort of bucket those into your more active devices and your in vitro diagnostics. And it's really the latter in the US that we're seeing a bit of movement on. The FDA kind of treated these almost as the Wild West. For a while, they used the phrase enforcement discretion. That's one that you're all familiar with, about whether or not they would look at laboratory developed tests, these tests that are sort of developed in-house. They're really not going to be under any FDA jurisdiction whatsoever unless the FDA believes there's reason for it to be. They've kind of flipped that on its head, and they're rolling it out over the course of 4 or 5 years. I think we're now in maybe year 2 of that, of really beginning to regulate laboratory developed tests as in vitro diagnostics. And to your point, Katherine, we've sort of seen this from a cross-cutting perspective across centers at FDA. I've been in a pre-IND meeting where a device was going to be used to determine some inclusion-exclusion criteria, and the Center for Biologics just said, you need to go to the Center for Devices. This is a significant risk device. You need to talk to them, get an IDE open before your IND. This is, of course, just one data point, but it was very different language than what I've seen previously. So it does make you wonder if we're already starting to see the effects of this rollout.
Yeah, and I don't think it's just the US. I mean, from a slightly different perspective, devices continues to be a hot topic in Europe with the implementation of the MDR and the IVDR. It's interesting to see the EMA starting to get more involved in the devices world as well, whereas previously, of course, we've always thought very much of the notified bodies being very much where we go for all things devices, but that crossover is starting to become...
Absolutely, yeah. And you do see medical device experts sort of penetrating through the expert working groups and scientific advice working parties and things like that.
Right. If you think about some of the complex devices that are used to deliver some of the ATMP products, for example...
They're not they're not exclusive of each other. So absolutely, there should be that crossover.
And all of the pieces around, and similar to what Eric was just saying there, what tests are being used in clinical trials, how they're being used, whether or not they're really meeting the right requirements. All of that is a big topic and getting an awful lot more scrutiny.
Yeah, and rightly so.
Rightly so. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I always sort of use the phrase like, what's the worst thing that can happen if the device fails? If it gives a false positive or a false negative. If you think about something like inclusion-exclusion for a cell or gene therapy trial, these are persistent therapies. If you get it wrong, there is really no turning around from that. So it's a very sensible approach, in my opinion.
It's a massive issue for your benefit-risk, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, really good point. Eric, I want to come to you around the US because we can't sit here and whilst I have to disclaim, not in any way, shape or form going to have any political opinions or talk politically, but we cannot get away from talking about the change in the political landscape in the US with the Trump administration obviously coming into force. There is going to be likely huge shift in how we regulate not just drugs and drug products, but thinking specifically here around healthcare and how the FDA is going to be set up and work moving forward. There are going to be changes, aren't there, Eric?
That's probably an understatement, I would say. Change does take time.
I'm trying to be politically correct there.
Yeah, change takes time, and we can certainly do this in an agnostic manner. You have a new political party who now controls the presidency and both chambers of Congress. So change is reasonably expected. We talked about crystal balls. I feel like I'm juggling three of them on the edge of a cliff when I talk about this, but it is a question I get all the time. Eric, what's going to happen with the FDA processes? I don't know, right? As I said, change takes time.
You're a very rich man.
We have a new head of the Department of Health and Human Services, Robert Kennedy, who was very recently approved by Congress. We know that I think his takes are more on like the deregulation side of things. I think he's of the viewpoint that there's more administrative red tape in place than there needs to be. I know we often think about this in light of drugs, biologics, ATMPs. He has some strong views on actually food as well. We forget that F in the FDA, I think, a few times. But what I do think is going to happen is, at the end of the day, we're going to see maybe, again, rolled out over time, if I had to speculate, potentially more of a laid-back approach just based on his prior viewpoints. I don't know how that's going to manifest in something like PDUFA action dates for an NDA or a BLA approval or anything like that. But he's made some very public commentary using psychedelic drugs as an example that he believes these should have already been approved. We'll use psilocybin as the example. We know that's in some of the late stage clinical trials for things like major depressive disorder. He's of the mindset that there's enough evidence in hand to justify the risk-benefit profile. And the last thing that I'll sort of say is, whether it was in the prior Trump administration with the response to COVID, or also the sort of the attitude that we're seeing now, when we think about the concept of risk-benefit, I think there was more of a mindset of, let's worry more about the risk. If there's not that risk, let's see if the benefit works itself out. Again, how that ultimately winds up manifesting in regulation, guidance, time phasing, I can't really say. But that is sort of maybe some of the overarching change that we can expect.
Aside from the obvious huge change in political landscape might bring, there are some more tangible changes or things to look forward to in 2025 when we talk about regulatory innovation. One of which is sort of our bread and butter, or the things that we sort of forget about in terms of how we actually submit regulatory documents through to the agencies. And last year, there was a shift to ECTD 4.0 at FDA. So FDA accepted applications within that format since late last year, and obviously will now continue to do that moving forward. And similarly, EMA has a phased adoption plan for that with voluntary use of ECTD 4.0 in 2025. So the way that we submit applications is maybe changing as well this year.
Yeah, and Eric, you might know more about this than me. I believe FDA is changing some things around SUSAR reporting as well.
Yeah, I think that's a good example. And that was a draft guidance document, I believe, that was released sometime last year. So I don't recall the action date off the top of my head, but SUSAR reporting has kind of been classically through an application on the backbone of the application through the electronic submissions gateway. It may be more, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, this is more how they do it in the EU, to its own kind of centralized database. It'll be direct reportability.
So lots of things to sort of look forward to or not look forward to, as the case may be, when we think about ECTD. But moving back into the more innovative section of regulatory affairs and novel technologies that we're all very lucky to work on here at Boyds, cell and gene therapies are obviously going to continue to be, a huge area of investment. There's lots of clinical trials in advanced therapies that are, reaching fruition and going through to the later stages of development. So unsurprisingly, we're seeing an increase in the approval of these type of novel drugs. So last year, the FDA approved around 59 novel drugs, which was an increase from the previous year. And nearly half of those received some form of expedited review. So I think it's fair to say that we're going to see the continued exploitation, for want of a better word, of those expedited pathways for advanced therapies. And we are seeing that market for advanced therapies, unsurprisingly, because of where the clinical development phases are right now, it's going to exceed a significant amount of money by 2027. I think it's projected around $45 billion for the advanced therapy market alone. So there's a lot of activity happening within this novel technology space in both the EU and the US.
Yeah, it does feel like the funding's starting to come back.
I think so.
And there's an awful lot of the smaller companies starting up again, seeing an awful lot of those really, really early programs coming through. So yeah, I agree. It does feel like it's continuing to blossom. I do wonder still how much it's going to continue to expand in the EU, particularly with the HTA regulation, joint clinical assessment, because these things are often not very cheap. Yeah. So until some of that is addressed, I do think, that's somewhat speaking outside of the regulatory world per se, I feel like the regulators are doing a pretty good job at understanding all the challenges and working with companies for the development of some of these innovative products. But we've got to remember we still need to try and get it to a patient.
Absolutely.
So I put a shout in for small molecules as well, because, I am a fan. But actually, and we've had a lot of siRNA and oligonucleotide programs coming through as well. It feels like they're really ramping up after the initial challenges of them in the early days. There's quite a few approved now. I feel like they're a much more accepted modality.
Totally agree. And in terms of thinking about platform technologies, which is something that we saw a lot of in 2024. Katherine, again, you and I had the pleasure of speaking to Dr. Peter Marks from FDA.
Your career highlight.
It really
was a career highlight.
We talk about it a lot, but it really was.
I feel like I'm fangirl now.
Absolutely. It was really interesting to hear his perspective and him talking about the use of expedited pathways and the use of platform technologies and how we apply those particularly to advanced therapy type products is only going to continue to explode in the US. And then, as we see, often the EU tends to follow suit, or at least have an opinion on these things when we see them expressed in the US first. In terms of advanced therapies, we can't really talk about them without talking as well about rare diseases, because often these very expensive, complicated, novel technologies are indeed designed to meet the needs of rare diseases, ultra rare diseases in some cases. So I think the incentives and initiatives that we have for rare disease development in both the EU and the US is probably going to continue to be a focus for 2025. Is there anything that you can speak to there, Eric, around rare disease development in the US?
Sure. And yeah, just to follow up on your last point as well, we're talking about crystal balls here. If you go online, about 6 years ago, almost, Peter Marks had a prognostication that in the year 2025, there would be between 10 to 20 cell and gene therapies approved. Not terribly far off, I think, from a forward-thinking perspective. So I find that interesting. And as you've noted, and having been able to interview him, he's definitely a pioneer and he's very forward-thinking. The one other thing I would talk about is the concept of accelerated approval in the cell and gene therapy space, where we've more classically thought that through in solely the oncology space. So to your other question, rare diseases, and oftentimes there is a lot of overlap between rare disease and cell and gene therapies, as oftentimes it might come from something like a genetic defect that requires a more advanced therapy for treatment. There are a couple of things here. The first, and this is something that is still a little bit nebulous, is the rare pediatric disease voucher. And this is something that's been available to manufacturers for several years now. And every time that we thought that it was going to go away, Congress has reauthorized it. And I think that was sort of the thinking this time again.
Well, I believe that actually Julie and I predicted that in a podcast earlier last year. So you're gonna demonstrate that our crystal ball is faulty, or at least correct, aren't you?
Well, and maybe it's just still a couple of months behind. We'll see. But unfortunately, as far as we know right now, it was not reauthorized in the most recent continuing resolution at the end of last year. This is just me opining. I think this would be very unfortunate if they were to get rid of this. I think it was a great program to begin with. We know that rare diseases in and of themselves are often a little bit more challenging for manufacturers, because when you think about profitability, it's just not there with the low patient numbers. We know FDA has a number of incentives to combat this, but then even thinking in the rare pediatric disease, that's yet another subset of an already small subset. So to see this go away, I hope that it's not going to be the case. I'm hoping to be proven wrong here, but as of right now, we just don't have that reauthorized.
Yeah, which, as you say, is a shame. So thinking about the pediatric vouchers, it's a good point, Eric, because I think we've all seen personally some real benefit to our clients and have experience with utilising those pediatric vouchers. So it will be a shame if it's not to be reinstated. But I think you raise a good point around ultimately it's what we can do to help get these medicines to patients in need. And for rare diseases, and particularly for pediatric rare diseases, that's really difficult. And we need to remember that the patient is ultimately central to everything that we do. And that continues to be a theme as we move into 2025, and maybe even more at the forefront of considerations when we come to think of developing drugs, Katherine.
Yeah, I mean, patient involvement's part of the CHMP work plan for 2025. It's part of CTR. We've started to see fairly consistently, actually, ethics committee questions coming around whether or not patients have been involved in the design of clinical trials and reviewing the ICF, etc., which seems like a very sensible thing to do. Why would you want to conduct a clinical trial that just doesn't work for the patients? Then they drop out of it. They don't want to be involved. They don't want to be reading 90-page ICFs. So, yeah, and I think that patient involvement piece hopefully will continue to evolve through 2025, rightfully so.
Absolutely. And the same, I think, for the US as well, Eric. There is an element to patient centricity that continues to grow.
Yeah, for sure. And I will say I read the blog by Chris Moore here at Boyds on exactly what you were talking about, Katherine, and that was new to me. So it was very, very interesting to read for sure. And it's, of course, entirely sensible. I also think about patient involvement from the not only perspective of holistically designing your clinical trial and utilizing patients, advocates, patient health organizations as early as like your early formal meetings with FDA to really incorporate their opinions and thinking through your application, but also from the utilization of the generated real-world evidence and real-world data and how that can influence regulatory decision-making. There is going to be a push, I think, just based on guidance recently promulgated as draft, maybe going to be finalized, new guidance coming that is going to be taking a lot more of, again, just this real-world patient perspective into account when the regulators at FDA are making their decisions.
Yeah, and I've said this before. I feel like real-world evidence and real-world data are one of those things that have been discussed for the entirety of my regulatory career. It's been quite a long time now, but doesn't ever seem to have quite reached the potential that everyone thought it was going to. And I do wonder if 2025, maybe this could be the prediction that I get held to when we do this next year, but maybe 2025 will be the year where that does start to come to fruition, particularly with the push towards use of AI tools, understanding of big data sets, etc.
Yeah,
Well,
it might be.
We'll find out, won't we?
That's it. It might be that we actually have the tools to be able to implement what we hoped would be realizable with real world data and real world evidence. So one to watch. As always with these podcasts, they fly by and we do cram a lot of information into them. So I know we've talked about a lot in terms of predictions for 2025. I think that the headline ultimately that AI is going to continue to be a big theme across all elements of regulatory affairs and healthcare development as a whole. Our legislation is ever evolving and changing and continues to explode, particularly with changes to the political landscape and also changes to understanding in how we know how these novel technologies work and things like that. So there's lots to keep an eye out for and lots we've covered. But is there anything else that you think we should talk about when we think about 2025?
Oh, is there anything else? I mean, we finally got through implementing the CTR. It's now mandatory and everyone should be doing it. I do think there's going to be an awful lot more happens over the course of this year about optimising it. I do think that the ACT EU group have done a really good job of trying to iron out some of the creases, but it's not completely flat yet. So we'll see what comes out of that and trying to make sure that clinical trials are being run effectively in the EU. And no, Eric, anything from your side?
Yeah, we talked very briefly about the rare diseases, more with a focus on pediatric disease, but I do want to note as well that CDER and CBER centers are collaborating with their innovation hub for rare diseases. They recently released an agenda upcoming. I think it's really interesting. I've always felt working in the rare disease space, you had to be in the room with the regulators to really know that what they were thinking. It just wasn't there in regulation or guidance. And more importantly, just from a consistency perspective, CDER and CBER have the same mandate, but have often gone about it very differently. So the question sort of remains, could they get on the same page? And I think these are efforts towards transparency, consistency, and innovation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's fair to say, just as a closing remark, it's not just the rare disease space where we are now seeing CBER and CDER starting to collaborate, or at least talk to each other and share information. So that's certainly one to watch for 2025 as well. As always, a very interesting podcast.
We've covered a lot.
We have covered.
Is that just on the basis that if we talk about enough, something will be right?
Let's hope so. We'll see. We'll definitely recap towards the end of the year and then look forward to having you both back in 2026 to talk about hot topics then. But for now, I think it's fair to say the podcast has got some really interesting topics to at least springboard from in this 2025 hot topics talk. And there's lots to come in the rest of the year. So please continue to like, subscribe and tune into the podcast for more regulatory and other topics in drug development. Thank you both for being
our guests. Thanks very much for having us, Harriet.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Conversations in Drug Development, the podcast series brought to you by the team at Boyds. Don't forget to follow us on the usual podcast platforms or visit our website to ensure you don't miss out on any of our future episodes.